Why discipline beats motivation every single time. Here is a quiet, uncomfortable question worth sitting with. How many of your best intentions have died, not in a moment of dramatic failure, but simply on an ordinary morning when you didn't feel like it? Almost no one abandons their goals in a blaze of catastrophe. There's rarely a single decisive moment where someone consciously decides, I quit. Instead, there is a slow, quiet erosion. A workout skipped because you were tired, a page not written because inspiration didn't come, a difficult conversation postponed because you weren't in the right headspace. Each decision on its own seems harmless, but stacked together over months and years, they become the invisible architecture of an unlived life. We have been sold a myth, one so pervasive we rarely question it, that the reason we don't follow through is that we lack motivation. Find your passion, the myth tells us. Get inspired. Watch the right video, hear the right speech, feel the fire, and then the discipline will follow naturally. But this myth has it exactly backwards. Motivation was never the ignition switch for a meaningful life. Discipline was. And the people who understood this, from ancient philosophers to modern prisoners of war, didn't wait to feel ready. They built a structure sturdy enough to survive the days when they didn't feel anything at all. The problem. Nearly everyone has experienced the same frustrating cycle. You watch something inspiring, a speech, a transformation story, a highlight reel of someone else's success, and for a few hours, sometimes a few days, you feel unstoppable. You make a plan, you set an alarm, you promise yourself this time will be different. And then, inevitably, the feeling fades. The alarm goes off, and the fire from 3 days ago is nowhere to be found. You feel tired, uncertain, distracted by something more comfortable. And so you skip it, telling yourself you'll start again tomorrow when the motivation returns. But motivation, by its very nature, was never built to last. It is an emotional state, and emotional states are designed to be temporary. Expecting motivation to sustain a goal over months or years is like expecting a single spark to keep a fire burning through an entire winter without ever adding more wood. The problem isn't that people lack willpower or ambition. The problem is that they've built their entire strategy around a feeling that was never designed to be reliable in the first place. This creates a particularly cruel loop. When motivation fades and the effort stops, people don't usually conclude motivation is unreliable. They conclude something far more damaging. I must be the kind of person who can't follow through. The failure gets internalized as a character flaw rather than correctly identified as a flawed strategy, and that false belief becomes its own obstacle, making the next attempt even harder to start. Human psychology. Psychologists who study behavior change have found something that consistently surprises people. Motivation is not the cause of action nearly as often as it is the result of it. In other words, we tend to assume we need to feel motivated before we act, when in reality, taking the first small action is frequently what generates the motivation, not the other way around. Momentum builds from movement, not from mood. This connects to a concept researchers call the action precedes motivation principle, closely tied to how the brain's reward system operates. When you begin a task, even reluctantly, even for just 2 minutes, your brain often releases small amounts of dopamine simply from the act of engaging, which can build into genuine motivation once you're already moving. But if you wait for that dopamine to arrive before you begin, you may wait indefinitely. because the brain typically doesn't release much reward chemistry for a task that hasn't started yet. There's also the psychological concept of decision fatigue. Every choice you make throughout the day, what to eat, what to wear, how to respond to a message, draws from a limited pool of mental energy. Relying on motivation means relying on a fresh, in-the-moment decision every single time you need to act, which is exhausting and unreliable, especially later in the day when that decision-making capacity is depleted. Discipline, by contrast, works by removing the decision entirely. When a behavior becomes automatic, a fixed time, a fixed routine, a non-negotiable commitment, you're no longer asking yourself whether you feel like it. The question has already been answered in advance by a version of you that wasn't tired, distracted, or making excuses. Finally, there's a well-documented psychological trap called the intention-action gap, the space between what we plan to do and what we actually do. Most people significantly overestimate their future motivation and underestimate how much their future self will resemble their present, imperfect self. We plan as though tomorrow's version of us will be more disciplined, more energetic, more willing than today's version. It rarely is. Discipline works precisely because it doesn't gamble on that assumption. It builds systems for the tired, uninspired version of you, because that is who actually shows up most days. Human nature. To understand why this gap between intention and action exists so universally, it helps to look at something deeper about human nature itself. For most of human history, energy conservation was a survival advantage. Early humans who expended effort only when necessary, who rested when resources allowed and exerted themselves only for essential tasks, were more likely to survive periods of scarcity than those who burned energy indiscriminately. Our brains evolved to seek the path of least resistance by default. This isn't laziness in any moral sense, it's an ancient, deeply wired energy conservation instinct. This is precisely why comfort feels so magnetic and discomfort feels so repellent, even when we know intellectually that the difficult path leads somewhere better. Human nature did not evolve to optimize for long-term goals like writing a book, building a business, or transforming physical health over the course of a year. It evolved to optimize for short-term survival, and the mind still runs largely on that ancient operating system, even in a modern context where scarcity is rarely the actual threat. There's another piece of human nature at play, our extraordinary capacity for self-narrative. Humans don't just act. We construct stories about why we act, and those stories become self-reinforcing. A person who tells themselves, "I'm just not a disciplined person," will unconsciously seek out evidence to confirm that story, and will interpret each lapse as further proof, rather than as an isolated, correctable event. Discipline, understood correctly, isn't primarily about resisting temptation through sheer force of will. It's about deliberately constructing a different story, one built through small, repeated proof, not through occasional bursts of inspired effort. Storytelling. Perhaps no story illustrates the power of discipline over motivation more powerfully than that of Admiral James Stockdale. Stockdale was a United States Navy pilot who was shot down over Vietnam in 1965 and spent the next 7.5 years as a prisoner of war, much of it in solitary confinement, enduring repeated torture, with no reliable information about when or whether he would ever be released. There was no motivational speech capable of sustaining a person through that kind of prolonged uncertainty. There was no fresh burst of inspiration available in a windowless cell, and yet Stockdale not only survived, he became a source of extraordinary strength for the other prisoners held alongside him, organizing covert communication systems and enforcing a code of conduct that helped an entire group of men endure years of captivity with their dignity largely intact. Years later, Stockdale revealed the specific source of the discipline that carried him through those years. Before ever becoming a prisoner, he had studied the writings of the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus, a man who had himself endured slavery centuries earlier. Stockdale credited Epictetus's teachings, particularly the idea that we cannot control external circumstances, but can always control our own judgments and responses, as the framework that allowed him to function methodically, day after day, without needing to feel hopeful or motivated in the conventional sense. He didn't rely on optimism that things would improve soon. He built a rigid, internal discipline that didn't depend on believing rescue was imminent at all. What became known in business and psychology circles as the Stockdale paradox captures this precisely. The ability to maintain unwavering discipline and faith that you will ultimately prevail, while simultaneously confronting the brutal facts of your current reality without the false comfort of forced optimism. Stockdale later observed that it was often the most optimistic prisoners, the ones who kept predicting an imminent release date, only to be repeatedly disappointed, who struggled most psychologically because their entire endurance strategy depended on motivation and hope arriving on schedule. Those who instead built a steady, disciplined structure, independent of when relief might come, proved far more resilient. Stockdale's story is an extreme case, deliberately so, because it strips away every comfortable illusion about motivation. In a windowless cell, with no certainty of rescue, motivation simply had nothing to attach itself to. Only discipline built on principle rather than feeling could function in that environment, and what worked in the most extreme conditions imaginable turns out to be exactly what's required in the far smaller, far more forgiving battles of ordinary life. The gym at 6 in the morning, the manuscript nobody's asked for yet, the difficult conversation nobody feels ready to have. Stoic insight. It is no coincidence that the philosophy which carried Stockdale through years of captivity is the same philosophy that offers the clearest framework for discipline in ordinary life. Epictetus taught that our task is not to control outcomes, which are rarely within our power, but to control our own effort, judgment, and response, which always are. Applied to discipline, this means the goal was never to guarantee success or to feel motivated on any given day. The goal is simply to act in accordance with what you've judged to be right, regardless of the emotional weather passing through you at that moment. Discipline, in this framing, isn't about defeating your feelings. It's about correctly recognizing that your feelings were never meant to be in charge of your actions in the first place. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself as Roman emperor, returned again and again to a strikingly simple instruction: get up and do the work of a human being. He reminded himself, seemingly on mornings when he didn't want to rise from bed, that the natural world doesn't wait for feelings of readiness. The sun doesn't hesitate to rise. The plants don't wait for inspiration to grow. He treated discipline not as an act of heroic willpower, but as simply fulfilling one's basic function, the way any living thing fulfills its nature by continuing to function regardless of mood. Seneca offered a particularly practical insight for building this kind of discipline. He advocated regularly practicing hardship on purpose, eating simply, sleeping without comfort, deliberately exposing oneself to minor discomfort, not out of asceticism for its own sake, but specifically to train the mind not to be ruled by comfort-seeking impulses. A person who has practiced discomfort voluntarily finds it far easier to act, despite discomfort, when it's genuinely required, because the nervous system has already learned through repetition that discomfort is survivable and temporary, not a signal to retreat. Together, these three offer a coherent alternative to the motivation myth. Build structure, independent of feeling. Treat effort as an obligation to your own nature rather than a reaction to your mood, and deliberately train your tolerance for discomfort so that discipline becomes less about resisting yourself and more about simply continuing to move. Modern application. This ancient framework maps directly onto nearly every corner of contemporary life. On social media, the entire economy of content is built around manufacturing brief bursts of motivation, a highlight reel, an inspiring quote, a transformation video that generate a quick emotional spike and very little lasting behavior change. People consume motivational content compulsively, mistaking the temporary feeling of inspiration for actual progress, when in reality, watching a video about discipline requires none of the discipline it describes. The modern trap isn't a lack of access to motivation, it's an overabundance of it, consumed passively, substituting for the far less glamorous work of simply starting. In careers, the professionals who build lasting success are rarely the ones who feel most inspired most often. They are the ones who show up to write, build, or refine their craft on the ordinary, uninspired days, the ones nobody sees, the ones that never make it into a highlight reel. Talent gets people noticed. Consistent, undramatic discipline is what actually compounds into mastery over years. In relationships, discipline shows up as choosing to communicate honestly, even when it would be easier to withdraw, choosing to show up for a partner on a day when you'd rather focus only on yourself, choosing patience during conflict rather than waiting to feel more understanding before extending it. Love sustained purely by feeling tends to be fragile because feelings fluctuate. Love sustained by consistent, disciplined care tends to survive the inevitable seasons when the feeling temporarily fades. In friendship, it looks like checking in on someone even when you're busy, showing up to support someone even when your own motivation to socialize is low, maintaining connection through consistent small effort rather than only during moments of dramatic crisis or celebration. And in the broader landscape of modern self-improvement culture, there is a particular irony worth naming directly. An entire industry has been built around selling motivation as the solution, precisely because motivation is temporary and must be repurchased again and again. Another video, another book, another course, another burst of inspiration to replace the one that just faded. Discipline, by contrast, is largely unmarketable, because once genuinely built, it requires very little outside input at all. It is quiet, unglamorous, and almost invisible from the outside, which is exactly why it remains rare and exactly why it works. Conclusion. Motivation will always be a pleasant guest, welcome when it arrives, but never reliable enough to build a life around. It shows up unpredictably and leaves without warning, and any structure built entirely on its presence will eventually collapse the moment it departs. Discipline asks for something far less exciting and far more durable, not a feeling, but a decision, made once and then simply honored, day after day, regardless of what mood happens to be passing through on any given morning. Stockdale did not survive 7.5 years of captivity because he felt hopeful every single day. He survived because he built an internal structure that didn't require hope to function. That is the quiet, unglamorous secret hiding beneath nearly every disciplined life, whether it belongs to an ancient philosopher, a wartime prisoner, or someone simply trying to keep a promise they made to themselves on an ordinary Tuesday morning. So the next time you find yourself waiting to feel ready before you begin, pause and ask a different question. Not, do I feel motivated enough to do this today, but simply, what would I do right now if I had already decided this was non-negotiable? That single shift, repeated enough times, is not a small thing. It is, quite literally, the difference between a life that waits for inspiration to arrive and a life that moves forward, regardless of whether it ever does.